بدي mental health لإلي. يلا we're live. Hello. Hi, Dr.
Hello.
Nicole.
Hi,
How
Sandra.
are you?
Good. I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. How are you doing?
I'm good. We're really looking forward to the session tonight, and a big thank you for having for giving us your time ويور هيك dedication وpassion، وخصوصي بنفتح مواضيع معك، يعني صرنا معودين معك نفتح مواضيع هيك difficult topics أو topics that usually we don't talk about. منفضل نخليها جواتنا، خصوصي topic الليلة. يعني we all have experienced at some point in our life the loss of a loved one. وعادة in our culture وبمجتمعاتنا we are expected to stay strong, to keep it together، ما نعبر. بالعكس يعني نقطع الجريف كتير بسرعة، وخصوصي إذا عنا مسؤوليات وإذا هيك we have to be up on our feet very quickly. So to all the audience who is watching tonight, we're all eager to listen to you and to understand هيك نفهم حالنا أكتر، نفهم هالبروسيس كيف بيصير. حتى مرات إذا مش نحنا at least how can we support people around us who are grieving. تنفهم كمان how do we give them the right support. So we're really keen on listening to you tonight. نحنا just to explain لأنه في ناس جداد معنا on the app who have joined. I can see new names. So we're going to spend with you around maybe 40 minutes talking. You share a PowerPoint and you explain شوي from a theoretical point of view، وبعدين بننقل معك we create a safe space. ونحن هلأ عم نسجل and we are live. مشان هيك we urge all the attendees اللي معنا please ask us your questions و ask the questions in the Q&A on the app in front of you. عندكم section اسمها Q&A. You can ask your questions anonymously ما يبين اسمكم بالrecording. You can interact with us through chat كمان. و in 40 minutes بننقل على room بنخلقها. منقلكم كيف it's very easy. Also on the app it's a safe space، ما بنكون عم نسجل، وهيك بنقدر to interact ونسمع بعض، ويمكن نتشارك خبرات. وهيدا يعني هون this is the power of the Sira roundtables is that we don't only learn and interact with the expert but also with each other to support each other. ويمكن إذا قاطعين بذات الخبرة ذات التجربة بنقدر نفيد بعض أكتر. So don't worry, we'll walk you through the whole process. عنا ساعة ونص معكم مع دكتور نيكول نسمع أكتر about grief. I'll leave you the floor, Nicole. وإذا بتعرفينا عن حالك لأنه معنا ناس جداد، وأنا I'll be monitoring the Q&A for any questions. We'll kick off our topic for tonight.
Yeah, as always, I'm happy to be here, Sandra. مثل ما بتعرفي يعني I'm quite passionate about helping to raise awareness بخصوص different mental health topics, just to also introduce some of our newcomers على Sira and how it works. فيكم تشوفوا على البلاتفورم either on the app أو على الويب إنه في كذا topic ممكن الشخص يختار. يعني في more على individual side، في topics خصوصي للcouples، وفي كمان أشياء للparenting و teenagers. So there's a bit of everything for everyone. وفي a bunch of different specialists that come to speak here. أنا واحدة منهم, as some of you might already know, or for the newcomers, welcome. مثل ما ذكرتي ساندرا، يعني التوبيك تبعنا اليوم هو it's quite heavy. It's about grief, and for some people they might have already experienced what grief is like. For others they may have not yet, but the truth is we all will at some point experience it. Loss is a natural thing that occurs. Loss بيقدر يصير in the physical sense when we lose someone to death, and it can also happen in the sense of other areas of life, the loss of a job, the end of a relationship. So loss is something we're all bound to go through at some point. بس خصوصا اليوم رح نحكي عن dealing with the death of a loved one. That being said, I just would like to say, please لكل العالم اللي معنا اليوم, take care of yourselves. This is a topic that can bring up difficult feelings. And so when I say take care of yourself, if you need to log off if you need to step away a little bit, do what you need to do to look after your mental health. كمان هيدول السيشنز بيكونوا مسجلين so للأشخاص اللي they need to leave early, they can always come back and log on to the app and then watch it at their own time. Is it normally uploaded right away, Sandra, ولا بتاخدوا نهار to upload the video?
No, on the app, it's right away. On YouTube, it takes us 1 day. So they can find the session tomorrow on YouTube.
Brilliant. So you can access it in both ways. Great. So a little bit about myself. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm based in the US. I'm also a certified grief educator. So I've taken sort of extra trainings بخصوص هذا الtopic for several reasons. Experiencing grief myself and noticing بخلال السنين اللي كلنا we went through the pandemic, grief and loss became something more pronounced and brought to sessions from my clients. So حبيت to learn more about this to see how I can help to support others. People would like to learn more about me, they can check the website. That's www.meadowspath.com. We can probably write it in the chat later on. You're welcome to reach out to me through there أو كمان through سيرة messaging option إذا بتحبوا تراسلوني بخصوص شيء. All right, so without further ado, I will share my screen here. Okay. Can we see it okay? Is it up?
Yes.
Great. Right, so today's outline إذا بدكم للسيشن حنحكي شوي عن شو هو الجريف شو هو المورنينج والbereavement لأنه هول الثلاث كلمات يمكن we hear them used interchangeably quite a bit. So just a bit of terminology going through that بالأول. حنحكي عن the different types of grief and the different models of grief. Some of them you might be familiar with. There's a really popular one by Kubler-Ross. Others maybe less common. بس كمان بحب أحكي فيهم وتركيزنا حيكون أكتر عن how to cope with the death of a loved one. Feel free at any point مثل ما قالت Sandra to ask questions على messages. You can do so, I believe, anonymously here. So I don't mind receiving questions at any point. مش ضروري نعملها بس بالآخر. So even as I'm speaking, if there's anything you'd like to share, questions or comments, feel free to do so. قبل ما نبلش كنت محضرة شوية statements اللي هن هيك true false statements just to get the audience engaged. So بركة Sandra, now would be a good time if you can share it with our people here today.
It's already shared. So قدامكم على الأب. We've published polls. I see a lot of attendance. So قدامكم on the app, you can find polls. بلشت الناس كمان تجاوب Dr. Nicole. So you press على polls وبيبين عندكم 3 أسئلة. If you can please answer the poll, هيك نقدر نعرف رأيكم بالstatements يلي نيكول حطتهم.
Yeah. So even if you're not sure about the answer, just take a guess. As always, I like to remind people you're not being tested. This is more for your own knowledge, and hopefully by the end of today's session, تعرفوا الأجوبة الصحيحة لهول statements. So we'll give it about maybe 30 seconds.
Okay, 30 seconds and then we can stop.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right. So Sandra, أنت فيك تشوف responses.
Yeah.
Could you please share that with us?
Of course. So أول واحد, if you don't cry, it means you are not sorry about your loss. False. كلهم قالوا false, 100%.
Great. And that's the correct answer. We'll talk more about what what grief looks like, how it's experienced internally, and how it can be experienced or seen on the outside. So one way that people show أكيد their sadness or their grief is through tears, but that's not the case for everyone. يعني ما في one size fits all. كل واحد بيعبر وبحس بهالاشياء على طريقته.
Next question. Grieving should last around a year. So عندك 90% false وعندك 10% true.
Okay, so there is no timeline for grief. Some people believe, wrongly believe إنه في مثل deadline إذا بدك أو timeline إنه by 3 months لازم نكون we moved on with our lives and no longer experiencing this profound sadness or pain, but the truth is grief is something that we live with for the rest of our lives. If and when that occurs, grief is a traumatic experience and it's a transformative experience. So it forever changes us. ما في وقت معين where, the alarm goes on and we're like, oh, okay, it's done now, So yeah, ما في وقت in specific for this. So what about the last one, Sandra? I think it was about moving on with our life means
forgetting about your loss. 100% false.
Absolutely. And, for obvious reasons, but we'll talk more about that later. So thank you all for participating in that.
كمان إذا بدك.
Already في أسئلة?
Already.
Okay, بركي in a bit, let me at least talk about grief, bereavement, and mourning, and then I'll take a few questions. Okay, so بس لنحكي عن grief هو it's a natural response to loss. والloss بيقدر يكون any type of loss. Loss can be loss such as in the physical sense, مثل ما حكينا, death of a loved one, death of a pet, or it can also be in other senses, losing a job, financial instability, or relocating, moving to a new country. All of those could be examples also of us experiencing losses. A person can experience all kinds of difficult, unexpected emotions. ما في, like I said, a one size fits all. كل شخص حيكون عنده رياكشن مختلفة. So من هالرياكشنز الكومن اللي ممكن الواحد to experience it هن الشوك, numbness, anger, disbelief, guilt, anxiety, fear, وأكيد profound sadness. والgrief process بحد ذاته can be compared to a roller coaster ride because it has its highs and lows. On some days people might feel like they're doing better, on other days يمكن بيحسوا إنه they're still stuck and the pain is very immense and they're still where they are. So I think the best way to think of the process really is that it's a metaphor. بداية الroller coaster ride it's when it's the most difficult. So what we find كمان for most people إنه أول ما يكون في الخسارة, the feelings of grief are very intense and they tend to كمان change over time. مثل ما ذكرنا ما في timeline للgrief وما في expiry date. However, this is a timeline that helps us to understand how grief changes. أمرار في شيء نحن ممكن نختبره اللي هو اسمه anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is when we are expecting إنه حيكون في a loss قريباً. So مثلاً إذا في شخص got diagnosed ب terminal illness أو إذا عارفين إنه قريباً we're going to get laid off from work, we would already start experiencing grief, and that type of grief could be defined as or labeled as anticipatory grief. لما يصير death in this case, لأنه عم نحكي اليوم عن death, أول شعور تبع الجريف is what we call acute grief. من بعد هيك لسنتين بنسميها early grief, and then for the rest of our lives it's what we call mature grief. So أنا كثيرابيست لما شخص يجي لعندي بهمني أعرف where they are in the timeline of their grief, because that way I can know better how to support them and help them in their healing journey. لما نحكي عن mourning is what we do on the outside. So أكتريتكم هون اليوم عرفتوا إنه أكيد مش بالضرورة إذا الواحد عم بيبكي أو ما عم بيبكي بيدل على the extent of their sadness or their grief. Everyone shows or expresses it in their own way. So like we said, some people experience or shed tears, others don't, and that's completely fine. The reason why that's fine is because grief بحد ذاته is a unique experience. So we can never really compare one person's loss to another person's loss and say, oh, this is how it should be done. So if we think of grief as something that happens inside of us, we can think of mourning as being sort of what happens on the outside. Bereavement, هيدي الكلمة نحن we use it لما عم نحكي عن the whole experience that follows after death. So grief and the mourning combined together هو كل هالفترة نحن بنسميها bereavement. So it's appropriate to say لشخص who has lost someone, إنه this person is bereaved. Okay, that's also just part of language that I wanted to clarify. No, I find a lot of the times people use these three words interchangeably. So I'll pause right there to take any questions أول شيء على هيدا السكشن أو كمان ساندرا إذا في شيء قلت there were a few questions I can take them now.
All right, so عندك سؤال how to deal with the regret of not expressing love or showing affection to our loved ones who have passed away.
That's a great question. I'm going to write that down and probably come back to it a bit later because I will be already touching on a هيك subject. So بركي جاوب على السؤال anyways. But I'll write it down here. So how to deal with the guilt and regret, right? Mm-hmm.
Yes, not expressing love or showing affection.
Mm-hmm.
تاني سؤال, my father 1 year ago passed away 1 year ago, and whenever I hear his favorite songs or see an old man or even someone mention his father and family, I start to cry. Is it normal?
Absolutely. It's absolutely normal for us to have any emotional response or reaction to loss. مثل ما قلنا ما في وقت معين وخصوصا كمان around the time of anniversaries or celebrations or birthdays, you know, these are times where our emotions are heightened and we might remember our loved one even more. And like this person has shared, you know, sometimes seeing a person who resembles his or her father can remind them of, you know, the fact that their father is no longer with them. And so it's, again, very normal for us to become tearful or sad or to experience any other emotion. And can it anger and can, you know, depression for some people, they might fall into depression. Whatever is experienced, again, is quite normal. ما في شيء عنا بنقدر نقول هيدا صح هيدا غلط ما بيسوى. So I hope that answers that question. Anything else, Sandra?
بعد عنا سؤال. My father died 2 months ago. I'm not processing it or thinking about him or crying, but I'm having severe panic attacks at work and anxiety and fear. I'm not crying over him, but I'm so scared all the time now.
Yeah. You know, anxiety is a very common response following the death of our loved one. And it's not talked about as much as some of the other emotional states, مثل anger and sadness, but anxiety and the experience of panic attacks بيصيروا كتير. And again, we'll talk more towards our session today on what we can do to cope with that, with these types of feelings that come up. Okay, so I'm going to go into, you know, types of grief. So أولاً في شيء عنا نحن بنسميه delayed grief. Delayed grief هو, as the name suggests, الشخص ممكن ما يكون عنده immediate reaction. Okay, so هون يمكن نشوف إنه الأشخاص they might feel numb, they might not be thinking about their loved one who's just passed away, and one of the ways that we explain this is that our body goes into survival mode. Amrar, our brain wants to protect us, you know, wants to keep us safe. We might already be going through so much بحياتنا that dealing or thinking about the loss is just too overwhelming. So the brain almost blocks it off, you know. So هيدي نحنا بنسميها delayed grief, when the person doesn't really feel it in the moment. Doesn't mean that they won't at some point. They probably will at their own time and pace. But this is, again, something we need to relate back to a survival mode. It's our brain trying to protect us from too much. Another type of grief is something we call disenfranchised grief. هيدي يمكن less talked about, or it's a term that we don't hear very often. إذا بتكون هيدا type of grief هو when our grief is minimized. So let's say I lost my pet. You know, I might feel like I can't really talk about that to someone who's lost their dad. You know, I might think, oh, their loss is bigger than my loss, so I shouldn't really talk about my pet loss. So any type of grief that is minimized, dismissed as not being big enough or good enough to be talked about هو بنسميه disenfranchised grief. وأكيد هيدا الإكسبيرينس ممكن يكون كتير lonely للأشخاص because there is no comparing. You know, grief is grief, pain is pain. Loss is loss. We can't say, oh, my pain is bigger than your pain. You know, there's no way to ever compare, and should ever there be a scale to compare. Okay, inconclusive grief هو لما ما يكون في جدة. So as we know in culture, religion, in our rituals, it's very important to have a body. Having a body helps us in that process of grieving. It makes that realization of death more real for people. The acceptance, knowing it, seeing it, بيساعد الأشخاص. So لما يكون في cases الجدة ما نلاقت, let's say because the person died from murder, or because the person is in another country and they're waiting for their body to be transported to their home country, or for whatever reason, لما ما يكون في جدة, it makes it a bit difficult, you know, for people to wrap their heads around that. You know, لاحظت إنه recently على نتفليكس كانوا حاطين هلا سيريز جديد اللي هو دوكيومنتري عن الماليزيان airlines. ما بعرف إذا some of our viewers here are familiar with that. So I think about 10 or 9 years ago كان في طيارة that went missing. And كان فيها تقريبا 200 something passengers. And, you know, I had started watching that and I found myself thinking about inconclusive grief, how for many family members, ما عم بيلاقوا evidence بعدهم, they were searching for the bodies. It was so difficult to sit with the uncertainty, right? So that is what we call inconclusive grief. كمان it breeds conspiracy theories. Okay, complicated grief. هيدا الترم I think has become more popular. عم نستخدمه أكتر. At least I'm seeing على social media عم بيكون في a lot of emphasis على this type of grief. So complicated grief is when our painful emotions, they don't get any better over time. So إذا بتتذكروا فرجيتكم التايملاين, you know, of when there's acute grief, there's early grief اللي هي بخلال أول سنتين من بعد ما الشخص يتوفى, بعدين في شيء اسمه mature grief. إذا من بعد سنتين وثلاثة ما شفنا أبداً إنه الشخص has been in some ways able to carry on with their lives, resume with certain activities that they once used to enjoy, this is what we would, you know, identify or call complicated grief. And it would be very important إنه يكون هيدا الشخص or receiving some type of, you know, support or help بركي من professionals at this point. You know, I just want to say إنه grief is not something نحن بالضرورة بدنا to fix. Okay, when someone is in grief, it doesn't mean that they're broken, you know. It means that they are going through something absolutely devastating. And like I said, their life has forever changed. What helps in this healing process is to have some sort of support. هيدا السبورت ممكن يجي من family, ممكن يجي من أخصائي, ممكن يجي by attending, you know, grief support groups and being with people who have gone through a similar type of loss. So the idea of receiving support in our journey of dealing with grief is what's you know, important here. And again, it's not for the purposes of trying to fix anything. We cannot fix what has been lost or gone, but it's about healing and finding ways for us to carry on with our lives despite this enormous amount of pain. Another type of grief is what we call collective grief. أكيد لأكترية العالم اللي بلبنان يمكن كمان هيدا الterm is quite familiar to them. So collective هو لما the majority of people will experience the same type of loss. So إن كان بخصوص الانفجار, إن كان بخصوص instability بالبلد, you know, this is something that everyone, the citizens there are all going through. So we call this type of grief collective grief. And whenever there is a group of people that can relate to that, again, due to some event that might have taken, whether it was a natural disaster or otherwise, we call that collective. لما الشخص, by the way, Sandra, has any of these types of griefs, it doesn't happen in isolation. يعني ما بيعني إذا أنا عندي complicated grief, I don't have ما بعرف collective grief. They can overlap.
Yes.
Absolutely. Traumatic grief, I think all of grief can be classified as traumatic. It's interesting that we have that there as a type of grief, but the way I see it is all types of grief and losses can be traumatic for people. Anticipatory, already حكينا عنها. It's when we are anticipating إنه حيكون في loss قريبا. Cumulative هو لما الشخص يكون عنده عدة losses صاروا بفترة قصيرة. So for example, death of a loved one, loss of a job, you name it, هول صاروا بفترة قصيرة. هيدي بنسميها cumulative grief. Secondary is what accompanies the primary loss. So for example, I remember in one of our sessions بعتقد من 2 weeks ago, كان في حدا سأل عن their relationship. They were going through a divorce, and we talked about how the end of a relationship, which was her primary loss, was accompanied with secondary losses. The secondary losses عندها لإلها كانوا, the loss of the idea of a stable home or a family or building a future and dreams with this partner. So بيكون في secondary losses that come with the primary loss. في هون اشياء على الشات. انت عم تكتبيهم ساندرا؟ اوكي.
عنا كتير أسئلة.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, perhaps we'll address them more towards the end because I'm noticing إنه they are more specific. أو كمان إذا ما جاوبتهم بهيدا الزوم, we can talk about them more بالروم. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to talk in this section about the models of grief. The models of grief, Sandra, they are theoretical models. They are meant to help us understand what could happen with people. It's not what should happen, but it's what could happen with some people. The most common one that I'm sure many people might have already heard of or they're familiar with, it was developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in, I think, around 1969. أساساً هي Elizabeth Kubler-Ross شافت إنه في مرضى كانت عم تشتغل معهم, والمرضى اللي عم تشتغل معهم هول patients, they were going through certain stages. After she wrote about these stages, other people came along and said, okay, بنقدر نستخدمهم هول for other things, for other types of losses. So الstages هن denial, depression, bargaining, those are the ones that I'm sure some people have heard of. بس كمان بدنا نشدد كتير هون إنه مش بالضرورة الشخص يقطع فيهم at all. You can go through them, it happens. If you do go through them, مش بالضرورة كمان to pass through them in a specific order. I think نحن عنا misconception إنه it happens in a certain order وبالنهاية بنوصل acceptance and like that's it, things are resolved. It doesn't happen that way. There's no, resolution. There's no end goal. These are things just to explain what might happen with someone. So لما الشخص يكون بدenial أو اللي هو بالعربي إنكار, a person is clearly in a state of shock. Again, بنرجع بنحكي عن البرين, كيف the brain is trying to protect us. So the brain sort of blocks, if you will, from us processing all that information. So we might be thinking, no way, إنه هيدا الشيء يصير, it can't be happening, I can't believe it. الشخص اللي ممكن يكون in denial كمان عنده البelief إنه الشخص اللي توفى ممكن يرجع. So these are some of the things that a person might be going through إذا هن ب state of denial. بس تيكون في anger, typically الشخص wants to assign blame onto somebody. And we might be asking the question, why is this happening to me? who's to blame. You know, بالanger, we're very caught up in the feelings of unfairness because there is no fair way to think of death. You know, whether a person was ill or died by natural causes, it's going to feel very devastating, and it's normal to experience anger. And for so many people, sometimes that anger is projected or directed to God. You know, some people step away from religion or spirituality because they're so angry and they want to make sense of it. ليه عم بيصير هالشيء? So sometimes we find that they might blame God. They might even blame the person that died. You know, why did you leave me so early? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't we have more time? They might even blame themselves. يا ريت أنا كنت موجودة أحكي معهم, you know, be with them more. I wish I showed them the love that I felt. I wish I appreciated them. So the anger could be directed inwards. Bargaining هو لما نحن نجرب نعمل نوع من الديل. So let's say إنه نحن بنعرف في شخص مريض with a terminal illness and we're already experiencing anticipatory grief. One way that we might be dealing with it is by saying, for instance, يا رب إذا بتشفي لي my loved one, you know, رح صير أنا روح أكتر على كنيسة أو رح صير صلي أكتر أو رح صير whatever. So sometimes we hope, you know, that we can somehow have a deal, you know. So إذا ما بتخلي هيدا الشيء يصير أنا رح صير إنسانة أحسن, أنا رح صير مؤمنة أحسن, أنا etc. So this is kind of what we call bargaining, that people try to find ways to deal with it in that way. Depression هو طبعاً الاكتئاب لما الشخص يكون بحالة complete sadness, unable to see anything positive. They might isolate, withdraw, يقعدوا فترات طويلة لحالهم, يمكن they don't want to interact with people, you know, they might have difficulties with sleep, you know, that sort of stuff. So I'm too sad to do anything about it. Acceptance هو لما نوصل لمطرح نتقبل يلي صار. وبدي شدد إنه نحن لما نتقبل يلي صار هيدا ما بيعني that we're okay with what happened. هيدا ما بيعني إنه we approve of it. You know, the pain is still there. It doesn't go away if we accept it. There's a space where the two things can coexist. I can still be in pain because my loved one is no longer with us, and I can accept that this is what has happened, you know. لما الشخص يكون عم بيقطع either of those stages, يعني مثل ما قلنا ما بيجوا بتسلسل معين. It's just the way that Kubler-Ross explained it at one point. فصار عنا هيدا الassumption إنه it happens, you know, A, B, C, but again, it doesn't work that way. People can fluctuate. يعني شخص ممكن يكون بمرحلة depression, يرجع يلاقي حاله صار بمرحلة anger, يرجع يلاقي حاله بفترات صار بمرحلة acceptance, يرجع يحس okay في another day صار anger. So like I mentioned earlier, grief can be thought of as a roller coaster ride. قبل ما توفت Kubler-Ross, actually be one of her books, she said the following statement. I feel it really explains her model very well. So هي قالت إنه these stages were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. They are responses to loss that many people have, but there is not a typical response to loss, as there is no typical loss. And I really love that statement, Sandra, because again, it helps us to understand, you know, there is no way that I can ever compare my loss to another person's loss. Our grieving is as individual as our lives. فهون بحس إنه كتير وضحت على موضوع الstages إنه we don't have to go through them in any way or at all.
هون كيف نعرف نقول إنه نحن يعني هالجريف قطعناه أو we are not stuck. يعني في كتير منا هلأ وقت قلت الستيجز عم نفكر إنه هل نحن بعدنا علقانين على ستيج معين ولا we're okay. لأنه مثل ما قلتي هالجريف يمكن ما يروح كل حياتنا، بضل عنا زعل بشي محل، بنضل نحس بشي. كيف نعرف إنه this experience قطعناها ما بدنا مساعدة بقى أو مش علقانين شي محل؟
Yeah, that's a really good question, Sandra. كل شخص لازم to reflect على حاله وعلى حياته ويسأل حاله when did this grief occur؟ قد ايه صار لي أنا عم بحس بهالشعور اللي عم بحس فيه؟ هل الشعور اللي عم بحس فيه كان عم بيختلف معي؟ هل أنا قدرت أرجع على حياتي استمر بحياتي نوعا ما ولا بعدني أنا حاسة حالي معلقة وأبدا ما في progress نوعا ما. So I think it's a very personal experience. كل شخص has to ask themselves that. And like I said, those 2 years are typically what we call early grief. هون for most people it's the most difficult part. إذا الأشخاص بعد حسوا إنه بعد سنتين أبداً ما في شيء تغير معهم, then I would say هون we need to again seek more support. Think about other ways to receive help. Okay, so بعتقد عندي 2 more models كنت حابة just to share them only because هيديك is so popular. في غير models ما نحكوا فيهم, بس Bowlby, John Bowlby هو الشخص اللي حكى عن attachment theory, so we might have some people here who are familiar with attachment theory, secure attachment, insecure attachment. ما حنفوت بهيدا الشيء, بس أساساً Bowlby هو قال إنه لما نحن we lose a loved one, what happens is that we're losing a type of attachment figure in our life, right? So a type of relationship has come to an end. And he says that typically people might experience some of these, feelings, which we know is true, either from our own experiences or what we see in other people. Very common, إنه الشخص يكون عنده shock and numbness, not processing what has happened. And we might find إنه في other symptoms, usually physical symptoms, مثلا البانيك attacks, أو ضيقة النفس, أو كوابيس, بالليل. That sort of stuff can manifest. Yearning and searching, whenever a loved one passes, our life changes, like I said, 180 degrees. فنحن بهمنا to find some sort of meaning to continue with life, because suddenly life is not as bright and rosy and colorful as it once was. So we're searching for meaning, we're searching for some way to continue, and we're still trying to process those difficult feelings. بيكون في disorganization and despair, وكمان almost as a way of moving forward, we readjust our life and we accept and find ways to continue, اللي هو reorganization. So مثل ما عم بتلاحظوا إنه some of these themes متشابهة ببعضها. Another model of grief is by William Worden. هو قال إنه في 4 tasks تبع grief. قال إنه for us to be able to cope with grief and to process it, أول شيء لازم نتقبل the reality of the loss, to work through the pain of the grief, to adjust to the environment without the deceased, اللي هي كمان كتير صعبة. Adjusting to the environment without the deceased might also mean the person has to learn new skills. تنفترض that your loved one was the person who took care of bills, or who would, take care of taxes, whatever sorts of things. يمكن هول الأشياء you might not be familiar with. So the person has to adjust to taking on new roles, new tasks, because the deceased is no longer with us. And then, as we can see here, the final stage is to emotionally relocate the deceased and move forward with life. Again, moving forward with life does not mean that we have forgotten the pain, that we have forgotten our deceased. It means that we're trying to find a way to begin living again, to begin living. All right. So David Kessler هو شخص اشتغل مع Kubler-Ross اللي حكينا عنه بالأول, اللي حكيت عن denial, acceptance, كل هول. And David Kessler قال إنه there are needs for the grieving person, things that need to happen for them to cope with loss. أول شغلة حكى عنه هو عن having pain witnessed. Having pain witnessed in بنظره هو بيعني إنه نحن لازم نكون بوجود الشخص اللي عم بيقطع بجريف، ولازم نسمح للشخص اللي عم بيقطع بجريف يحكي عن their loved one. You know, we need to ask them about who this person was in their life. You know, how did they contribute to shaping who they are? You know, I think listening to the person, being there with them, allowing them to express themselves is what David was talking about. You know, بدنا نسمح للشخص, like we said, to have their pain witnessed. وإذا بتفكروا عن how we go about funerals, you know, بالfunerals people come together. You know, we have our pain witnessed by attending funerals and with people coming and giving us their condolences, right? So this is part of how pain is witnessed.
تعرفي وين كمان حسينا يمكن الفرق هو وقت كوفيد، وقت ما كان عم ينعمل funerals، إنه هل قد إيه أهمية to have this pain witnessed. كان كل هالمرحلة بتقطع كتير بسرعة، الواحد بيكون لحاله، ما في تعزية، ما في support من الكوميونتي. يعني واحد بيحس بالفرق بس يعيشها بغير طريقة.
Yeah, 100% Sandra, you're right. And a lot of people that I worked with were having such a difficult time not being able to travel. يكونوا موجودين وقت الfuneral, وقت الburial, you know, for all of those cultural, traditional, religious things that we have in place, you know. It can be more isolating for the person. Again, it's part of how important it is for us to have pain witnessed. وكمان على هيدا الtopic, you know, some people got creative and they would put a camera for the people overseas يحضروا funerals. You know, I remember all of those things happening too. Yeah. The second important thing is to express feelings. You know, a lot of the time خصوصاً بالمجتمع تبعنا we have this idea of ما بدي عطل العالم حوالي هم. You know, so I'm just going to keep things to myself. I'm going to put on my strong mask. You know, I'm fine, ما في شيء، صار اللي صار, this is what God wanted. You know, we have these ways of kind of coping with things which can bottle our emotions up. It only reinforces this idea of suppress. شو بيصير when we suppress? Eventually, مثل ما حكينا, the more we suppress, the more حيكون في intense rebound effect إذا بدك، أو حيطلعوا هول الأشياء بغير طرق, usually physical symptoms. You know, the person might start having tremors, headaches, مشاكل بالنوم, that kind of stuff. So very important for us to be able to express our pain. By expressing pain على فكرة مش بالضرورة نحكي فيها. في أشخاص they don't want to talk about it. You know, other people might express their pain by writing. You know, writing could be their way of coping. They want to write about it, write a poem, write about that person's life, write a letter, you know, get creative through arts. Whichever way, أهم شغلة إنه to express هول المشاعر. We got a question earlier about releasing the burden of guilt. حدا سأل earlier, you know, how do I deal with the guilt and regret of not showing affection?
Affection and being there.
That's right. And this is something we often hear quite a lot from people, Sandra. When a loved one passes away, we no longer are able to have a physical connection with them. And it's very normal for us إنه نرجع نحن تنفكر عن كيف كانت علاقتنا مع هيدا الشخص. وأكيد لما نبلش نفكر بالماضي رح نلاقي إنه oh, there was this time I did this where I upset that person. يا ريت ما قلت هالشغلة. أو يا ريت كذا. So that's a very normal thing. Whenever we look back رح نلاقي quote unquote اشياء نحن شايفينها كأغلاط أو اشياء we wish we could have done differently. And it makes it a whole lot harder when we know إنه الشخص منه موجود physically معنا. So منلاقي إنه this feeling of guilt and regret comes up for people. Also saying things like, I wish I told them XYZ. You know, I kept it to myself all my life. And we find that when people are experiencing so much guilt, you know, they feel stuck. They feel unable to process their own grief because they're now judging themselves for what they should have done, could have done, and, you know, being very, very highly critical of themselves. And, you know, as David Kessler points out, part of the needs of the grieving is for us to release this burden of guilt. And to release this burden of guilt, it's like an onion, you know. I think it goes through layers, Sandra. إنه كيف البصل عندك, you know, قشرة, you go through it before you're able to get to the core. I think there's a similar process here where we need to take it one step at a time. You know, we need to really uncover what our guilt is trying to tell us about ourselves, about the hopes and dreams and the pain that we're feeling, and understand that it's normal to have these what ifs, you know, or yaret, you know. I think each person goes through it to some extent. However, staying in it for too long can make us feel very helpless and stuck. So it's very important, again, to address this head on and to talk about it somehow.
نسامح حالنا بكي أو نقطع ببروسس.
Absolutely. That's where the key is. It's about self-forgiveness. You know, it's so much easier for us to forgive other people than it is to forgive ourselves. Why did we find, because we put standards for ourselves that are so high. So إذا في شخص يعني غلط معنا in some way, we find the strength somehow to forgive them and move on. But when it comes to us, you know, the standards we place are very different. Part of that journey to release the burden, مثل ما قلتي Sandra, is learning about forgiveness, which is very hard. And forgiveness doesn't happen overnight. Again, it's a process. One day I can say, okay, I forgive myself for that. A couple of days later or weeks later, you're back to blaming yourself. Why did I do this? I should have done this, could have done this. So again, the forgiveness process takes time and looks different for everyone. Another thing is it's important for us to be free of old wounds. يعني مثل ما عم بتشوفي هيدي الفورث بوينت مرتبطة بالبوينت اللي هلا حكينا عنها. It's normal لما نحن نخسر شخص نفتح ملفات الماضي، منفكر عن علاقتنا، عن الاشياء that we went through with this person. So some old feelings are resurfaced, old pains. We might, like I said, even feel angry with the person. You know, why didn't you show up for me the way you should have? You know, maybe that person wasn't someone that you had a good relationship with, you know, and you're struggling to feel empathy or to feel sadness the way that you thought. You might feel angry that the person never showed up. Again, it's important for us to address these traumas, address these old wounds. هول يمكن يكونوا مرتبطين ب childhood experiences, and understand, you know, what is going on inside of you. بلاقي أمرار إنه releasing the burden of guilt and being free of old wounds, people who seem to be stuck with those things بيستفيدوا by talking to a professional. You know, some people are able to manage those feelings on their own. Some people don't. خصوصاً إذا هيدا الفeeling of guilt كان مطول. It's important, like I said, to discuss it. So منلاقي these are sometimes reasons why people seek help. Number 5 is to integrate the pain and love. So هون David عم بذكرنا إنه acceptance doesn't happen suddenly. Acceptance comes and goes. Sometimes we get it, we accept it, sometimes no. He's reminding us إنه it's a process, بس من ضمن هالprocess we are getting a step closer to acceptance لما نلاقي إنه في مطرح للوجع وفي مطرح للحب, and we can have both combined. ولما الحب يصير more profound and takes up more space than our pain, هيدي ممكن تكون إشارة لإلنا إنه we are also moving forward and getting closer to acceptance. So I really like the way that he puts it, because in other words, he's saying that نحن we grow around grief. You know, grief never gets smaller. Grief حيضله موجود, بس نحن as individuals, we learn to grow around our grief and to live with it. When we grow around our grief and we live with it, هون منلاقي إنه love is taking up more space.
كتير حلو اللي عم تقولي نيكول, لأنه نحن براسنا لازم يصغر هالحزن يعني, ومنحط بريشر على حالنا وغيرنا بحط بريشر علينا إنه يلا get over it، خلص لازم نطلع منها. كتير حلو عم تقولي إنه لا بيبقى الحزن مثل ما هو، ونحن اللي نتعود عليه، ونحن اللي منعيش معه، ويلي إنه نلاقي له معنى يمكن. في كتير يعني بعد ما قريت الأسئلة بس معنا كتير ناس اليوم who really have suffered يعني a lot يعني deaths of family members, death of children. It's not easy at all واحد يحط على حاله هالبريشر إنه لا أنا خلص لازم كفي حياتي، لازم أتخطى هالمرحلة كلها. أنا شخص ضعيف إذا ما تخطيت بسرعة، إذا ما تقبلت الوضع.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right, Sandra. سبقتيني actually على ال last stage اللي هو about finding meaning in life after loss, because for a lot of us نحن بنلاقي إنه life is meaningless afterwards. What's the point of carrying on? You know, our hopes and dreams and all of those suddenly vanish. We no longer have the same perception of life, you know. So هون ديفيد عم بيحكي عن how it's important for us to sustain هيدا love اللي حكيت عنه, continue to find ways to grow with that love towards that person, and to honor them in our lives. By honoring them in our lives, it might be carrying on with things that were important for this person. So مثلا, let's say somebody passes away and this person used to love having Friday lunches with the family. This family might continue بهيدا tradition to honor the deceased person. You know, this is a way that we keep their memory and their presence with us. So that's one way that, you know, David was talking about. You know, it's integrating the loss in a way that's meaningful for us, whether it's carrying on certain traditions, whether it's finding a cause that resonates for us. You know, this doesn't have to be for everyone, but, you know, for instance, I worked with a client whose mother passed away to cancer, and من بعد هيك she started a small organization where she would, you know, help people, and she would try to raise money so that she can, like I said, help support people who are suffering with cancer. That was a calling for her. You know, that was something that she felt drawn to and she wanted to do. Again, مش بالضرورة إنه this is the only way that we move forward. It might resonate for a person, it might not. But again, it's about not just staying in the pain. It's about moving more towards love and appreciation and paying attention to how to make life more meaningful for this person, you know. And أكيد, we can't, we don't have a future unless we have a past. You know, that's the way I also see it, that whenever we're thinking of our future and who we want to be, we are these people based on the stories that have shaped us from the past. So again, it's up to us then to start writing the story. أكيد كمان finding meaning هون, it's about finding something that's personal, you know, personal to you. For some people, this might happen months after the person passes away. For other people, it might take years to find some sort of meaning. The meaning doesn't always happen right away when a person dies. It can take time. And again, the meaning doesn't negate the loss. هيدا ما بيعني إذا أنا لقيت meaning يعني محينا loss, محينا pain. No, it's about the coexistence. في space للاثنين. By the way, actually, كمان finding meaning صار شيء إضافي للdiagram تبع Kubler-Ross. يعني it's become something that is more recognized هلا. For people that are interested, you know, I would recommend that they check out David's book اللي هو اسمه Finding Meaning. It's one of the books, you know, I sometimes recommend to clients. It can be very helpful to read. You know, he shares some stories about his work with clients and talks more about these needs of the grieving بديتيل أكتر. So if you're interested, you know, maybe check that out. So تنعمل هيك recap قبل ما نروح على الروم, Sandra. You know, the most important thing in everything that I've talked about maybe is accepting our emotions. we often judge ourselves. How come I'm not crying? How come I'm still numb? How come I'm still angry? It doesn't matter. It's okay for you to feel whatever it is you feel. لأنه your grief journey is your grief journey. You can't compare it to anybody else. And accepting your emotions also means if you feel like crying, cry. You know, if you feel the need to do so, you feel it coming, allow those emotions to be there. There is no way for us that we should feel. As we said, understand that your grief process is unique for you. You can't compare. Express your emotions and thoughts. It doesn't have to be about talking about it. If you're not ready to talk about it, you don't have to do that. It's okay. No one should feel pressured to talk. Like I said, there are other ways to express ourselves through writing in a journal, writing poems, creating a photo collage as a tribute to our loved one. There are many ways. أهم شغلة is to allow those feelings to be processed and to be put out there. حكينا شوي عن faith, and faith can be a very helpful factor for some people. Getting closer to faith, closer to God, closer to prayers can also bring an enormous amount of relief. Again, there's no one size fits all, but for many people, this can be very helpful. Preserving memories. You could do something to honor the person مثل ما قلنا, that was in your life, planting a tree or a garden, doing something they always wanted to do, making, again, a photo album that's unique, for that person. Finding ways, again, to just honor those people in our lives is important. Getting support. مثل ما قلت, support مش بالضرورة دايما يكون من family. Sometimes it's the last place we want to look for support. Sometimes our family members are dismissive. They might not offer us support the way that we want. Support means looking to family, friends, mentors in life, counselors, therapists, support groups, a parent, a faith leader. Those are the types of supports that are available to us. كتير مهم كمان to take care of ourselves physically. It's very easy for us to neglect ourselves when we're in grief, but it's important for us to think of the basics, trying to feed ourselves, hydrate ourselves, get some sleep. Those are the things that I'm talking about, difficult to do, but also very important to try to do those things. كمان planning ahead for grief triggers. So grief triggers ممكن يكونوا holidays, anniversaries, important milestones once upon a time for the person that's deceased. So having that in mind, planning ahead helps us, whether that means on a certain day you want to take it off from work, you want to spend it with your family, plan ahead. Well, I'm just going to end it by one of David's quotes here. He says, "We heal when we remember those who have died with more love than pain, when we find a way to create meaning in our own life in a way that will honor theirs." And, I find that to be, such a powerful way to put it. Some people here might resonate with that. Some people here might think, oh my gosh, that's impossible. I can't see myself getting close to that. And that's fine. I just wanted to share that. So I'll stop there, Sandra, and بركي فينا ننتقل على الأوضة, because I realized I went over time هون. I'm happy to address those questions that are, more personal now that I've covered, this lecture, if you will, or this section.
يعني أحسن لأنه we have really personal stories it's better if people can share them in a safe space أحسن ما نسأل الأسئلة recorded. So لكل يلي معنا رح ننقل على I'm gonna share my screen. كل اللي عم يحضرونا قدامكم على الموبايل اب نحن خلقنا روم. سو قدامكم على المنيو في كلمة روم بدكم تكبسوا عليها ورح تشوفوا روم مخلوقة. So this is a safe space ما منسجل فيه. وبالروم فيكم ترفعوا ايدكم وتحكوا. إذا أنتم مرتاحين. وفيكم كمان تسألوا أسئلتكم. نحن all the questions يلي نسألوا يلي ما تجاوب عليهم رح نجاوب عليهم بقلب الروم ونحكي فيهم ككيسز. وفيكم تحكوا مع دكتور نيكول لايف وتسألوها كمان أي سؤال يعني على الأشياء اللي حكيتها. So please move with us. نحن رح نوقف الريكوردينج هلا، رح يوقف اللايف ونقلوا معنا على الروم تنكفي الحديث ونقدر to support you better ونقدر نحكي عن cases انتوا عشتوها إذا عندكم كمان سؤال عليها. So أنا أيدت دكتور نيكول the questions. Let's move to the room and we can take them from there. Okay?
Sure.
I'll stop the recording.